My name is John Peterson. I'm one of the vice presidents at the Florida United Methodist Foundation. I'm also fellow clergy, and this is this conference year. I'll be finishing up my, don't remember if it'd be my 31st year in ministry. I've served in the local church, but I have been doing plan giving and financial planning with our foundation, and also with the Northern Illinois United Methodist Foundation over the last 20 years. This presentation is really going to be the base for everything else that we're doing that's going to follow, all the other presenters. So my goal and my hope as we begin this process is to give you and to talk a little bit about what financial planning is, what it is not, talk to you a little bit about the financial planning framework. Now, mind you, what I'm going to be talking about is going to be at the very high elevation. We're just going to kind of paint the background for you, and then we've got folks who are going to be coming in. James Clementson follows me, and it's going to be talking about Social Security. Then we got our folks from Westpath are going to come and talk about your pension program. And then tomorrow morning they're going to talk to you about, and hopefully you brought your computers and your PIN numbers, because they're going to show you how to log in and do your own projections. So you'll be able to begin to plug numbers onto that framework. And then tomorrow, after they're done in the morning, I'm going to come back and talk to you for a little over an hour about longevity planning. And that's basically, are you going to be able to live, retire on that which you are receiving from all your various sources, and also talk to you a little bit about clergy income taxes. In your workbook, you've got a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, but what I'm going to be what I'd like for you to take out is this workbook that's at the very back. It is the financial planning guide. We're going to be looking and talking about the information today and tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the information that's mostly on these sheets. There's several different definitions that are out there for financial planning. First of all, let me say anybody can hold themselves out as a financial planner. Mark already alluded to in his talk, though, that it is important, though, that you sit down, if you're going to engage in the financial planning process with someone, that you engage with somebody who does hold a financial planning designation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and where you can go to find those types of folks at the very end of this presentation. So let's just start with a couple of the definitions. On the CFP board website, they say that financial planning is the process, and notice that word process is underlined. It's a process of meeting your life goals through the proper management of your finances. And then, of course, it goes on just to list some of what your life goals could be. It is a process. It is not a product. It is not a program. So when we're talking about financial planning, we're not talking about various particular programs that are out there. There are some very good programs out there that are helping folks within our local churches to deal with various issues such as debt management. Can anybody think of any of those programs that are out there? Dave Ramsey Financial Peace, that tends to be the big one that's out there today. But that's really not financial planning. That is a product that's out there that is very good, that can help you with individual components of financial planning. I like better the second definition here that comes from the Financial Planning Association, and that is they talk about it as being long-term. So again, it's not a seminar that you attend. It's not a 3, 4, 5-month course that you may go through, but rather it's a process that begins when you decide to start the process, and it ends when you decide to end the process. And again, I like the fact that folks can manage their money, but there's a difference in managing your money and wisely managing your money. And of course, then it's also to achieve your goals and your dreams while at the same time negotiating the financial barriers that inevitably arise in every stage of life. And there are financial barriers that are there for all of us. So if you look at your first page in your book where you see it talks about adult life cycle, financial tasks, common errors, and desirable outcomes. This is a chart that has been out there for many years that has different financial tasks that are kind of broken down into various age groups. It talks about the various challenges in those particular age brackets. And it also talks about what some of the desirable outcomes are for each of those age ranges. Now, we're not limited to those age ranges, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. What I'd like for you to mark, if you would, go down in the 25 to 34, because that's really the age range that I have begun to work with clergy in our annual conference. I'm starting to work with clergy candidates and also some of our folks who have recently graduated from seminary. And what I want you to mark, because these are the errors, the common things that I'm finding among our young folks. And not just our young folks, but they can also carry over into every other age bracket. Lack of plans for educational expenses. I met with our clergy candidates this past week, and one of the first questions that I ask is, how many of you know what you're going to be making when you graduate, when you come out? Who knows what minimum salary is? And I think one person, now I didn't put them on the spot and say, okay, tell me what that number is, but only one person out of the entire group knew what they were going to be making at the end of their educational endeavors. And so I asked them the question, if you don't know how much money or resources you're going to have coming in, how on earth can you know how much debt you can handle? And we all know that that is one of the major stumbling blocks for many of our folks as they are going through the ordination process. I've sat down with folks with student loan debt, credit card debt, ranging all the way from, as a minimum, several thousand. Once in a while, somebody will come through the process where they don't have any debt. All the way, I've actually seen $150,000 of student loan debt, where somebody went all the way from undergraduate through to get their PhD, and they funded it all with student loans. So, lack of plan for educational expenses. Now, this one's not on there, but please write this one down, and that is no will. You folks are I saw all those hands go up when Mark asked you that question. You are the anomaly. Usually when we ask that question, around 50% of the people in a group, and we know that's about statistically accurate, about 50% of the folks in any group have no estate plan, they have no will. Lack of emergency fund and savings. That is another one. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Lack of sufficient short and long-term protection coverage. We're going to also talk about that in a little bit. But my experience is, and I've written over 100 retirement plans, and I've done a lot of work with our young clergy, and let me say that our clergy are significantly underinsured. Many of our clergy only have what is provided by the $50,000 by the Comprehensive Protection Program. And if you have a young family, folks, that is just not enough. If you move over to the 35 to 44 range, you may want to put no will, overuse of credit, failure to provide adequate protection, and failure to plan for retirement. If you go down to the 45 to 54-year range, failure to be realistic about government and private pension plans. Some folks think that if they have no resources, that the government is going to bail them out. That is just not going to happen. And failure to utilize professional expertise. There is a plethora of resources that are out there for us. You have the folks at our treasurer's office, Tony Prestipino, our foundation. We're there to help you if we can. You've got the folks at Westpath, and I know Bob is going to probably talk to you about Ernst & Young, which is another free resource that is available to all of us. So there are, and then GCFA. GCFA has a lot of information on their website. They have a tax packet there about clergy taxes. So there's a plethora of information that is out there that we all need to take advantage of. And then in the 55 to 64 range, failure to readjust insurance coverage, or no will, or a will that is out of date. And so we've got folks who are coming to talk about all of that stuff. We've got Tom Wilkinson, who's going to come and talk to you about wills and estate planning. We've got John Clarkson, who's going to come to talk to you about risk mitigation. And we have some other folks who are going to come to talk to you about real estate. How many of you, again, own your own home, your own property? Okay, quite a few. That's good. So as you can see, there are a lot of challenges in the financial planning process. If you'll turn to the next page, what you'll see, again, we're talking about it's a process. There is an orderly way to go about doing financial planning. So if you look at the very top, the first two items there, I believe, go hand in hand. And that is and I would put actually the one that's listed second there needs to go first. Assess the values, the attitudes, and the expectations. And then determine what the personal and financial goals are, the needs, and the priorities. My experience has been that when you sit down with folks and you begin to engage in the financial planning process with them, what do you think the very first thing is that they want to talk about? They want to talk about the money. One question: do I have enough money to retire? And I believe that is the absolute wrong place to begin the financial planning process. Because you may have financial goals that are out there, and you may have been very good at accomplishing your financial goals, but if your financial goals do not match that which you value, then there could be a great deal of dissatisfaction in your life. I'm sure we've all, as clergy, dealt with someone who we've seen who is very successful financially, who maybe have been a CEO or ran a company, who financially they probably hit every one of the goals they had, but in that process where they spent all that time and work, and Sandra mentioned that in the devotion, where they've neglected their family, and all of a sudden they're very financially successful, but they're miserable people. Why? Because their financial goals never matched up to that which they value. So I believe, and we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to have you do an exercise in a minute. That's where I think the financial planning process needs to begin. And then you have to determine a time horizon. And that's one of the reasons I asked, well, what are you thinking? When are you thinking about retiring? It's very important if you're doing retirement planning to look and see what kind of a time frame you have, if there are shortfalls, if there are certain tasks that need to be accomplished. It's important to know roughly how much time you have from where you are today to that date where you decide that you're going to retire. I thought it was also very, very interesting. I'd mentioned this, I forget who I was talking to, I mentioned that I asked this question at every R-10, when do you think you're going to retire? And the folks there's always a great deal of nervousness about even putting a timeline on that or defining it, except for the people who are retiring within a year. If you notice, they responded very quickly, and there was a completely different level of energy. Did any of you notice that? For the folks who were going to be retiring within a year. So determining your time horizon is important, and then they also need to determine your risk tolerance. And there are all kinds of tools that are out there if you're working with a financial planner. Of different types of risk assessments that they can take. I happen to like what Westpath does. They have absolutely simplified it for all of us. You're either conservative, you're moderate, or you're aggressive. Those are your, I believe, isn't that correct, Bob? That's your three choices: conservative, moderate, or aggressive. But if you're working with someone else on all the other assets that you may own in that, they need to know where you stand. What's your risk tolerance? You don't want to have all of your money in equities when you retire if you have a very low threshold for volatility. In other words, the stock market going down 20%, then it goes up 10%, then it goes down another 20%, and you can't sleep at night. So in the process, they're going to do a risk assessment, and then they're going to begin to collect your documents. They're going to collect a statement of financial position. We're going to talk about that in a minute. They are going to sit down with you and do a cash flow statement, and it's my hope at the end of our seminar you'll be able to look and see, because you'll have some idea of what your Social Security income will be. You'll know what you're getting from your pensions, and I'm going to give you a formula that you can plug in to do all of your other assets, so you'll at least have some idea of the amount of income that you're going to have in retirement. So they're going to do a statement of financial position, they're going to do a cash flow statement, and they're going to look and help you to develop a retirement budget. So those are the main documents, and then of course your estate planning documents are critically important as well. If you go through the financial planning process, they're going to look at your current financial status. That's what? Your statement of financial position. This is what I own. This is what I owe. This is my net worth. They're going to look at what your capital needs are. And that's important. When we start talking about what your values, your dreams, and your retirement goals are, the question has to be asked, how much capital are you going to need in order to do that which you want to do in retirement? So if you determine, I'm going to need a new car in 2 or 3 years, $30,000, whatever the value is of a car that you would buy. If you're talking about doing some trips, once in a lifetime trips along the way, you're also going to want to set aside some capital for that. And those capital needs won't be added to the other part of the equation that's going to look at what your retirement cash flow is. And again, they have life stage retirement income, which does exactly that for you, where you're able to say, look, down the road, I'm going to need $30,000. I'm going to need $40,000. Whatever that amount is that you determine, you will be able to set that amount aside, and then with the rest of the money that's there, you'll be able to see what you'll be able to live on that income stream. Okay? They will look, again, we mentioned the risk tolerance. Risk management is extremely important. Extremely important. How many of you serve on the Board of Ordained Ministry? A couple. This past year, I did looked at all the financials for all the candidates who were going through. And did you know, I don't know if you got the reports that I sent or not, but on every single report, there was one question that was asked. And that is, you need to ask them, do they have a will? And if they have minor children, have they named guardianship for that child? And the reason that is important is, especially when, the biggest issue that comes before our Board of Ordained Ministry is they're looking at debt. And they're wanting to make sure that the yoke of debt is either mitigated or eliminated if possible. But let me ask you, what good is it to have somebody work on eliminating their debt if there was a catastrophic event that would absolutely financially devastate the family? The first thing that they need to look at is not their debt structure. The first thing those candidates need to look at is, do you have a will? Do you have a guardianship for a minor child? And how much life insurance does the primary breadwinner have? Very important. And they also need to look at things such as risk exposure. I was working with several years ago with someone who was getting ready to retire, and I was looking at their statement of financial position, and I noticed that one of the lines was extremely large. This person had inherited a very high six-figure amount of stock, and in the process, the financial planning process, I was also looking at the risk management tools that were in place, and I looked at their auto insurance. And for liability, they had $50,000, $100,000. Now, why is that important? Does anybody know why that's important? One accident, we don't have the same reaction time we used to when we were younger. If that individual got into an automobile accident where they would have injured or killed somebody, the most that the insurance company would have paid was $50,000 per person or $100,000 for the entire accident. And if it would have been a fatality, it could have absolutely wiped out all of those assets that individual had. So that's another reason why you need to sit down with somebody who's looking at the total picture of everything you have to make sure that your assets are protected. And then, of course, I'm not going to go through everything here, but there are so many special needs that are out there. The financial planning process is complex. It's integrated. One thing affects another. So if you're not paying, if you're paying money because you're needing to purchase a life insurance policy for estate liquidity, that money may be coming and affecting some other part of your financial plan. So financial planning is integrated, it's complex, and it's individualized. No two are alike. Everyone's family situation is different. You have situations where folks have been divorced or widowed, remarried. You have where one spouse has child from one marriage, sometimes two previous marriages. You may have a child. There may be a situation where it's yours, mine, and ours. So this whole financial planning thing is fairly complex, but you also need to take that in mind. You may have a parent or a child that has special needs. There are certain things that need to be done there. Are we all clear on the financial planning process? Now, these are the things that these are the broader topics that need to be looked at. Income tax planning. When you look at what buckets you begin to draw your money from, it's important. Is it a tax deferred bucket? Is it a tax paid bucket? What bucket are you going to draw? Is there a benefit for drawing out of one bucket before you draw it from something else? Is there a benefit for me actually deferring one bucket to another, such as is there an advantage for deferring Social Security? Retirement planning, estate planning, investment planning, asset allocation, all of that, those are all the pieces of the puzzle that you need to look at. So it's not just about retirement, but it's about the entire picture. And I love this one because sometimes, in my experience in working with our clergy, and I love them to death, sometimes it's creating order out of chaos. we all go through, and I think you need to be mindful of this. Most folks go through the 3 stages of retirement. Again, I don't want to bracket. There's brackets that are there, but don't bracket yourself in. Everybody can experience these at different times. There's the go-go, slow-go, and no-go. And the go-go is right after folks retire. Most folks are beginning to do those things that they were just not able to do while they were working. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the free resources to do those things. And so what do you think happens to expended income during the go-go phase? It goes. It goes. Go, goes. It goes up. Your need goes up. And you have to be very careful in this stage that you don't spend too much. Because if you spend too much, the other 2 phases aren't going to look too pretty. The second phase is the slow go. And that's usually between the ages of 70 to 84. Folks really begin to slow down. Maybe they've done those things that they wanted to do in retirement. As they get to the end of that phase, what do we see happen a lot in Florida with our snowbirds? The folks that have come down here, they move down here to be in Florida to enjoy this nice warm weather. What do? They go back north to be closer to their children, So the slow go, and actually your expenses during that phase go down. You're just not spending as much. You don't need to. And then you hit the no-go phase, and that's where things, all the health issues begin to kick in, and there's usually significant changes in lifestyle. Now this could happen, the no-go phase can happen at 65. I'm not saying it couldn't happen at 65, but at that phase, the no-go phase, what direction do you think the outgoing money, your cash flow, what direction does it go? Does it stay even? Does it go down, or does it go up? It goes up. It actually goes up. Why? Healthcare and healthcare costs. And we've got somebody who's going to come and talk to you about that. So you have to think about all of those things when you approach retirement. Now, there's there's actually 3 different methods you can do when you do your goal-based planning. You can do goal-based planning. You can do cash flow, and you can also do a combination of both. If you're going to do goal-based planning, you really need to begin with that which you value. So if you'll look in your page that's next to the financial planning process, what you will see there is a values list. This is not a comprehensive list. Maybe the things that you value, maybe you would define them a different way. But what I want you to do, and I'm only going to give you a minute, maybe 2 minutes to do this, is look at that list. If there are anything that you need to add to that list, add it to that list. Now what I'd like you to do, if you've completed that, is on the right side of the list, is I want you to number from 1 to 5. and I want you to build a values ladder. Number one is the thing that you value the most. Number two would be the thing that you value the second most on down. At least list 5. If you can list more, but list the first 5 things. Has everybody completed that? 70 to 80% of your time and your resources should be spent supporting the goals that come out of the top 3 things that you value. 70 to 80% of your time and your resources should be spent supporting the goals that come out of the top 3 things that you value. Doesn't mean that you don't value those other things. Now, what we frequently see in doing this exercise is we begin as financial planners to find out whether or not there's what's called value conflict within what you say you value and what's actually transpiring. Let me give you an example. I did a financial planning seminar up in Lake Junaluska, and there was a clergy couple who were there, and other than their relationship with God, which I think all the clergy put at the top, the second thing they had down there was financial security. Financial security. And so we began this conversation, and they said, we're doing terrible. We just don't we don't feel like we're financially secure. We don't feel like we're going to be financially secure. What's going on? So I said, well, I tell you what, let's take a look and find out if what your behavior is actually supporting what you value. And so it didn't take long. I looked at their cash flow statement and where the money was going, and I said, well, it appears to me that you're hemorrhaging right here, and that is where you're eating out. These folks ate out every single meal 7 days a week, and they weren't going to 7-Eleven, which is expensive, by the way. So it didn't take long to look, and my comment to them was, well, you're hemorrhaging right here. Why don't you, I'm not telling you not to eat out, but if you could cut that down to 5 days a week, 3 days a week, and immediately the female clergy said, I don't want to have to do the grocery shopping, and I don't want to have to do the cooking. And I looked at her and I said, I never said that you did. But what you are telling me is you value your free time and your independence more than you value your financial security in retirement. There is always, and it's not a right or a wrong choice, but it's always about the things that we choose. when I was in Chicago, I used to catch the 511. I lived in the northwest side of, in one of the burbs, and I used to catch the 511 train into the city in the morning. And in every single, or in almost every single train station in the greater Chicago area, there is a particular coffee chain. And I noticed I was sitting there, and I'm a big coffee drinker, but I don't happen to peruse this coffee chain. But I noticed that as you get to see the very same people who are riding the train with you in the morning, and there was a line, 5:11 in the morning, there was a huge line in this chain. And I would watch these folks, 25, 30 years of age, every day with these big caramel macchiatos. And so I began to wonder to myself, what is it really costing them? What is it costing them, that caramel macchiato? So I figured it out. I gave them 2 weeks off for vacation, which was fine, but I figured it was costing them $5.30. That was the price of what it was in Palatine. And if they were drinking it 5 days a week for 50 weeks, it was costing them $1,325 a year to drink that cup of coffee. By the way, I call this little piece star-busted. And I began to think, over a working career of 40 years, at 6% interest compounded, do you know what that cup of coffee cost them? Any guesses? The cup of coffee, if they would have taken that money and they would have done something, they had a choice, right? We all do. Have that cup of coffee. It doesn't just have to be coffee. It's whatever the things are that we choose in our life. It cost them $220,000. That's what it cost over their working career for that cup of coffee. If only they would have cut down to 3 days a week, they would have had an additional $88,000 in their retirement. Now, there was a second thing that I observed about a lot of these folks too, and maybe it was the nature of being in Chicago, but they all ate out. They all ate out lunch. So I decided to run the calculations for eating out at lunch. $12 a day, which is, I think, is a reasonable amount. 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, is $3,000 a year. Over their working career, it is $500,362 for them to eat lunch, $12 every day. So between the lunch and the coffee, it was costing them almost $750,000. Now again, I don't tell people not to eat out. I don't tell people not to drink star-busted coffee. But these are the choices that we make. But that's true not just for young people. It's true for us as well. The choices that we do, the things that we do, and the things that we decide that we want to enjoy or not to enjoy. And that's where conflict, if we're okay with it, and it supports our values and our goals, then we're fine. But if it does not, then we have, as I said, we have value conflict. This was actually a values ladder that I had done with someone. And keep this in mind, too, that when you do it, there's questions. If you're sitting down with a financial planner, these are some questions. If somebody just says, well, I value financial security, the next question is, well, tell me what that means to you. What does financial security mean to you? And of course, we started to break it down. This person said, well, I want to have sufficient income for retirement. Of course, there were more questions that had to be asked on top of that. We wanted enough money that medical care, long-term care wasn't an issue, meaningful work. So this was something that somebody actually had done. So what eventually you want to get to is when you have your values, you built your values ladder, you prioritized your things. Now you're talking about what are the specific financial goals that I have that are going to match what I value. And when you're doing financial planning, they have to be, I believe, SMART goals. They have to be specific. They have to be measurable. Sometimes they have to be monetized. So it's not enough for somebody to say, I want to be able to take a trip every year, a 2-week vacation every year. Well, that 2-week vacation to you may look different than that 2-week vacation looks to you. So when you're sitting down and you're writing your particular goals, they need to be specific and they need to be monetized. The same thing I mentioned earlier with the car. If you got capital needs, I worked with one clergy person, and God bless him. We were going through this exercise with him. He said, and we were talking about capital needs. He said, John, he goes, I want to set aside this amount of money for a car. And I kind of raised my eyebrows. He said, I have been driving a piece of junk for the last 40 years, and I have always wanted to have a new car, but I always felt that if I had a new car, somebody would think you're paying the pastor too much money. That was his retirement dream. And you know what? He went out and he did it. It was wonderful. Specific, measurable, accountable. Somebody's got to be accountable in your family to making sure that the goal gets accomplished. It may be you, maybe your spouse, it may be both of you. But somebody has to be listed as being the one who's going to take the helm, right? I mean, how many of us in our churches have heard a great idea at an administrative board meeting and, oh, we thought you were going to do it, or we thought you were going to do it, and there was nobody ever was named to actually do it. They have to be realistic. And unfortunately, this is one of the sad things that I do when I've sat down with some of our retirees, because their goals and their dreams have been very big. And yet when you looked at the financial reality, the fiscal reality of their income stream and the amount of assets they had, it didn't match what they had hoped retirement was going to look like for them. And there has to be a time frame to it. Why? Anybody know why we put a time frame? It's the way we evaluate. It's the way we evaluate. So you set the time. Did we accomplish what we had set out to do? If you did, that's great. If you did it too soon, maybe whatever goal it was you had wasn't big enough. If you didn't get there, it's not a big deal. It's to say, okay, where are we at now, and why didn't we get there? And maybe the idea or the goal that you had originally listed has changed. So that's the process I think is important if you're going to do goal-based financial planning. Now, let me say, in working with clergy, and most of our clergy, I would say probably 80 to 90%, this is what they're looking at. They're looking at doing a cash flow rather than a goal-based. A lot of times I'll sit down and I'll say, okay, tell me what retirement looks like for you. And they have absolutely no idea. The only thing that they see is they see the finish line, so to speak. I'm not working. A lot of those things that you had listed and put up here that were very, very valid as clergy and as spouses. So if you don't have an idea of what your goals, what your retirement is going to look like, what you want to do, then this would be another way to look at, am I going to have enough money to be able to retire in the manner that I choose to retire? And that's what's called a wage replacement ratio. It's looking at whatever percentage of your, hear me, your net income, not your gross income, because your tax situation in retirement changes, and it changes drastically, is what amount of your net income do you need to replace in retirement to meet your needs? And that is going to be different for everybody. If you already own a home and are in a home, and many of you said that you do, and if it's a home that's free and clear, then a lot of times the wage replacement ratio, it can be as low as as 80%. If you do not own a home and you're going out for the first time, you will need possibly between 100 and 120% of your current level of income in order to maintain your current standards. So it's a different way, it's a completely different way of approaching planning. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, sometimes folks do both. They say, well, I don't know really what retirement's going to look like, but I do know I want that $50,000 car. Well, that's where we go, and that's where you would use life stage income, where you would set aside $50,000 in particular for that purchase of the car, either in your pension or out of other assets that you have. This isn't a lecture, folks, so if there's any questions too, please feel free. Now, the other thing that they're going to need to do is to gather together your basic documents. And the first thing is your statement of financial position. I always say, how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you are? When you do your statement of financial position, it's extremely important that not only do you list all of your accounts, but you also need to list how they are titled. Remember we said earlier there's a lot of yours, mine, and ours. Assets can be held in many different ways, and that can be a determining factor in how that asset is distributed or how that asset can be used in your retirement. So you want to list whether or not it's joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which is only available for your spouse. The other one that's similar to that is called tenancy by the entirities. Those are the only two ways that your properties can be titled jointly where there is a right of survivorship. Most folks don't know what tenancy by the entirety is, but that is where when you are joint tenants with right of survivorship, you have full rights to the property, but each person owns a 50% share of the property. That's why upon death there's a bump up in basis of property when somebody dies to the surviving spouse on a joint property. If it is tenancy by the entirety, you actually own 100% of that asset. Each individual owns 100% of that asset, and which means, and that's a way that property is titled. If you are looking at doing asset protection, because if your spouse has a job where there could be litigation, where there could be a claim against them, your spouse may have a judgment against them, but that asset cannot be attached because you own 100% of it. The other spouse owns 100% of it. So it's important that you list how your property is titled. It could be held tenants in common, where you own a piece of property, maybe with your children, maybe with somebody else. It doesn't have to be you have equal ownership, not necessarily equal shares. You may own 25%, somebody else may own 25%, somebody else may own 50%. And there's certain rights that are involved with that. So it's extremely important when you list your assets that you list how those assets are titled. Yes.
When does that happen? When you buy the property, or any time that you want to change that position?
Both.
And it's done with the lawyer.
That's correct. That's correct. That was a good. The question was, when do you title your property? Well, you can do it when you acquire it, or you can do it any time subsequent to that. And my recommendation is with any time you are doing something legal, that you have legal advice that an attorney is either reviewing the documents or producing the documents. Statement of any question about that? when we talked about these a while ago, when the estate tax was exemption was 600,000, there were an awful lot of people, and there were strategies. In fact, in some of our churches, there were strategies that had folks come in to talk about different strategies that you can use. Right now, with the estate tax exemption, I'm guessing, Bob, would you give me a 99.99% of all clergy have that earn in excess of 10 million?
Very few, John.
Very few. I would think very few. So these are, so you've got your statement of financial position. The next one, if you turn the page, would be your cash flow statement. Again, the first thing, and I think there's a retirement income and retirement expenses. Most people know the amount of money that they have coming in, but again, most folks don't know where the money is going out. So I think it's a great exercise for all of us, young people, those who are getting ready to retire. It doesn't matter I challenge you to take the next 3 months and track every one of your expenses to see where your money is going. Leakage in most people's assets aren't coming from major purchases. It's going out $10, $15 at a time. I did this exercise again with some clergy very recently, in fact, and it was revelatory to them because they had, and I don't know all of them because I'm an old timer, but they had Spotify and Netflix, and there were at least 5 or 6 different media providers that they were paying out money, and it wound up being like $125 to $150 a month, and they had absolutely no idea that they had that amount of money going out, and they were going out in very small chunks. So extremely important. Now, these are all pre-retirement financial considerations. These are things that hopefully you have already got in place, that you've got, and you've established a cash reserve, which is an emergency fund. Financial planners recommend that you have between 3 and 6 months of fixed and variable expenses in a liquid cash reserve account. 3 to 6 months. Now, one of the ways that if you don't, I want you to turn to the next. There's a thing on here on personal debt, but if you go to the page that talks about the cash management program. I grew up Southern Baptist, and growing up in my household, there were several things that were just repeatedly drilled into my head. I didn't like it at the time, but I'm awful thankful for it now. And one is this actual cash management program. My dad always said, the first 10% goes to God. No ifs, ands, or buts. The first 10% goes to God. The second 10%, you pay yourself. And then you learn to live on the other 80%. Now, that's not very Wesleyan, by the way. Because, John Wesley, when he began his ministry, did John Wesley tithe when he began his ministry? Anybody know? The answer to that is no, he didn't. He didn't. But when he began his ministry, he was giving 6%. 6%, and I got this from Richard Heitzenrader. He was giving 6% of his income went to ministry. When he died, he was giving 80% of his income to ministry. So what he learned to do was he learned to live simply, and as his income grew and the resources grew, that was money that he used to fund his ministry. But I think what I learned was the first 10% goes to God, The second 10% you pay yourself. And the very first place that that money would go, are you following the arrow down there? Pay yourself 10%. It goes into an emergency fund, a cash reserve, until you have between 3 and 6 months of fixed and variable expenses in liquid form. Why is it important? Why do you think is it important to have a reserve fund? You don't go into debt. You don't go into debt. Are things going to happen where are emergencies going to happen? Transmissions are going to go out on vehicles. Your kids are going to do some stupid things, or they're going to need money. And that's why an emergency reserve is there, and it keeps you from going and borrowing and getting into debt. Very, very important. And once you've funded that, then the flow of money then begins to go to the investment side. So hopefully everybody is either has one or is in the process of establishing a cash reserve. And then, again, risk mitigation. We talked a little bit about that, making sure that your assets are covered. Life insurance, even in retirement, is important, especially if you are purchasing a home for the first time. That may be something that you want to consider covering, because what we'll discover tomorrow is that as clergy, if you predecease your spouse, your income is going to go down fairly significantly, and can go down even more depending upon which options, pension options you choose in retirement. We've already mentioned the homeowners, renters, auto insurance, making sure that your liability is enough to cover any attachable assets that you may have. Long-term care insurance is another, I call them, it's another tool in the financial toolbox. And let me say, John Clarkson, again, will be here to talk to you about that and the need for long-term care insurance. But I think it's more important to say that you need to at least have a long-term care plan, because it is going to happen. And what are you going to do when that need arises? It's much better. It's less stressful on your spouse. It's less stressful on your family if you have a game plan going in. Again, you have to have estate transfer documents that includes a durable power of attorney. I know we all lifted hands that you said you had a will. Hopefully you also when you sat down and had an attorney draft it up, that he did a whole set of documents that include the durable power of attorney. Bob and I were talking at the last break, the fact that in a certain age bracket, you're more likely to become incapacitated than you are to die. And so if you become incapacitated and you have no power of attorney, then the courts have to step in and assume control. Healthcare surrogate, extremely important. That's another type of power of attorney. And again, Tom Wilkinson's going to talk to you a little bit about that. And then you need to have a health care directive or a living will. So those are all some of the things that you should have already had in place, or should already have in place, or be in the process of putting into place. Now, here's the $6 million question that you all came here to ask, and that is, do I have enough money to retire? Well, the answer to that is, I don't know. And the only way to really know that is either to run the numbers and get an appropriate wage replacement ratio, or to develop a goal-based financial plan where we begin to look at the assets and we match the assets to the goals. But what you can see here is, at the very base, we have Social Security. And we've got someone who's going to be coming very shortly to talk about that. And then your pension is broken down into many different pieces. Do we have anybody here that has pre-82? So we have some that have pre-82. Pre-82 is is a benefit. It's really is sort of a defined benefit for you that comes as an income stream. So these things that are here, 65% of your MPP, and they're going to be talking about all that stuff, it also comes to you as a defined benefit. It's interesting, I was doing, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, mentor training, and we were doing it here in the fellowship hall, and folks were there with, the mentors with the other folks, and nobody was paying attention. I looked out, they were all yawning, doing all that stuff, and I finally said, well, you all know that big number that you see on your pick, because I was saying, you need to have your folks, they need to be actively involved, they need to understand their pension, what they're getting, how it operates. And I said, you all know that big number that you see on your pension statement really isn't your money. And all of a sudden I had the attention of everybody in the room. You have a right to an income stream from that number. That's what a 403B is. It's a tax-sheltered annuity. And the way ours is written, at least 65% of that must be annuitized. And then there's options that they're going to get into and talk to you about that. And then the other part, and there's 2 other parts to that. That's your CRISP defined benefit. You got the 07 to 13, and you got the post 13. I call one CRISP. I call the other one CRISP Light. And then when you look out here, also this is also another bucket that you may or may not have, where you have a traditional IRA, which is a tax-deferred vehicle. If you have a traditional IRA, you have put the money in there, tax-deferred. What's going to happen when you draw it out? It's going to come out. You're going to have to pay taxes on it. So on all these little buckets here, you're going to be drawing out money, and there's going to be taxes. And then you've got these other buckets here. You've got your UMPIP, which is the money that you put into your own pension, the 35% bucket here, and then the CRISP DC, which is the defined contribution part of the 07 and post-2013 plan. These are your resources. This is your money to decide to do what you want to do with it. Some of that may be tax deferred, and some of that may be tax paid, depending upon how you. Now, all the MPP is all tax deferred, but with these other buckets, some of it may be tax, or you may have already paid tax on it. And I know, Bob, that maybe when you talk to them either tonight or tomorrow, is to have them understand how the money comes out when you have a mixed bucket like that. And then you have other things. Some of you have accumulated real property. Some of you may have a Roth IRA, which is a different type of retirement vehicle. And some of you may have a life insurance policy that actually has cash value to it. So when you come down to ask the question, do I have enough to retire? And I will show you tomorrow when I talk about longevity planning. We're going to actually look at some real numbers. I'll show you it's anonymous, but they've allowed me to use their numbers. I'll show you what somebody has actually done, what that looks like, and some of the recommendations that I've made to them as to how some of these monies here need to be distributed. Now, the nice thing is if you keep all of your money at WestPath, you can have this thing called life stage income, and they're going to tell you all about that. And you can have them manage the money, and you can have them do the rebalancing, all the recalculating. They can do all that wonderful stuff for you, but you may have other assets that need to be included, and the question is, what do you do with those assets? How do you draw down from those assets? What's an acceptable amount? Some of these, you can defer for a while. Social Security, there's some benefits for deferring that bucket. You may want to draw from it, you may not want. James Clemenson is going to come and tell you about that. There are some benefits to deferring drawing down Social Security, that not only you're increasing on one end, but you also protect the spouse, the lower earning spouse, on the back end. Your pensions, some of them, there's some benefit to possible deferment, but some of them, like your defined benefit plans, there's really no advantage to deferring those, so I would draw those when you retire. And then you have to decide about all these other things. What are you going to draw from, where, and when? Let me just give you one other example, and I just feel like I'm just talking on and on. Oh, we got a lot of time. I was working with this spouse of a clergy person who died, and we were looking at assets, and they had everything that they had pretty much was pension, and they had some IRA stuff that was deferred. And so the question became, because you can still take the marital exemption in the year of death, and so the question then became looking at where and this is what we're going to talk about tomorrow, where their marginal bracket was here, what they were paying currently, versus if we did some things with some of the other assets, if we could keep it within a particular bracket without them paying more, because we knew in the subsequent year, this spouse of this clergy person was going to wind up paying a significant more in taxes. And so what we did was we did what is called a IRA rollover. And we merely rolled it over from a traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. Now, there were taxes to be paid, but this person was going to be paying taxes at a much lower marginal rate than if they had waited for an additional year. So these are all things and things that need to that's going to be explained to you, and that you're going to need to know as you make decisions about your retirement. Now so what you'll do is you'll start looking, and again, this is just, you'll look at your projections. What percent are you getting from Social Security? It's going to be different for everybody. What percent from pension? And then you'll have a wage replacement ratio, and you'll have to decide, is that enough? Is that going to be enough? That number could be much higher. That number could be 80, and you say, you know what? An 80% wage replacement ratio works. In this particular case, if they were looking for 100%, they would need 35% of annual income would be needed. So then we'd have to run some calculations to say, okay, these are some of the steps, some of the things that you need to be doing in order to put more money away so that we can shorten that gap. You see the shortfall? The shortfall is 35%. Depending upon their age, we may be able to cover that shortfall, but at least we can look at how can we take that from 35% maybe down to 25 or 20. Threats to a secure retirement. Debt is right at the top of the list. Can anybody tell me what the time is, the correct time? 3:40. Okay. Debt is a major deterrent to anybody's secure retirement. Poor investment practices. We're going to talk about that when we talk about longevity planning. Is asset allocation is key. It's extremely important how your assets are invested in retirement. Poor distribution management, tax planning. I know the folks at Westpath are going to talk about that, especially for those of you who may need capital to purchase your first home in retirement. Single again. For those of you who are married, it's also important, and I'll show you that tomorrow. You need to run a retirement income baseline, not just as a married couple, but you also need to run it a survivor baseline. What happens if I die? What's that income stream going to look like? And is that going to be sufficient? And finally, the final thing, and I've mentioned this before, trying to go it alone. There's no reason why anybody in this room needs to go it alone. There are a lot of folks who are out there. Again, if you're going to work with a financial planner, these are the two designations that I recommend. One is the CFP, which is given through the CFP Board of Standards in Colorado, and the other is a Chartered Financial Consultant, and that is a designation that's awarded by the American College of Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. And then here's another wonderful resource that's provided to us through Westpath, and I'm going to let them really do that commercial, but you need to know that it's there, and it's available, and they've got folks who will do the entire thing for you. They'll send you the documents. I mean, you'll need to do the work as far as filling out the document. They'll do statements of financial position, cash flow, budgeting. They'll do all that with you. And the best part is right here. Does everybody see that? No cost. No cost. So there's absolutely no reason for you not to take advantage of that. It's confidential. And if you are working with someone else, I'd use them, but I use them to bounce other ideas off. Because I realize when I'm looking at my own finances, I can't be objective. So it's very important to have somebody who can be objective looking at that. These are some websites that you can go to that there's information. If you want to work with a certified financial planner, you can go there. There is a search engine there where you type in your zip code, and it will pull up a whole list of certified financial planners within your zip code area. They also have the same thing at the Financial Planning Association. There's also a search engine there to look for professional advisors. Now, the one that I like here is National Association of Personal Financial Advisors. What I like about this organization and the folks that they have on there, they are fee-based only financial planners, so they are not selling you a product. If you'll turn in your booklet to, we've given you some information that's directly from the financial planning website about hiring a financial planning advisor. I think there's a great deal of good information that's here, but the one I think you need to be aware of is how planners charge. That is one of the questions that you need to ask right off the top. Is how do you get paid? There are those who are, and let me say, you can be a product-based financial planner and still be an outstanding financial planner and still act as a fiduciary in someone else's best interests. But I do believe it does open the opportunity for the waters to be muddied if someone is trying to sell you a product that benefits them. So you need to, some folks are product-based where they'll sell you life insurance. They may be selling you an annuity or some other product, financial product for you to buy. There are others who are fee-based, who they're going to take you through that process that we looked at early on in our talk. And they will sit down and they will go through the process. They'll collect your information. They'll review your information. They'll write a financial plan for you. And there is a fee involved for doing that. And depending upon the complexity of your particular situation would determine what they charge. Some folks charge an hourly rate, and some folks charge a flat fee. But you need to know what that is right up front before you even engage them to do the work. Another thing, of course, after writing the plan, is to decide who's going to implement the plan. And that's just as critical as getting a plan. A while ago, they used to do where the kind of the vogue thing was folks were getting living trusts because they were trying to avoid probate, and they'd go to seminars and they'd sell them kits, and they'd fill out all these documents on living trusts, but they didn't know that they needed to actually retitle their assets into the trust. And so by their spending all that money and creating a living trust, it did them absolutely no good. Because all those assets that weren't titled in the living trust wound up going through probate anyway. So you have to ask, you know, if you were to implement it, or is there an additional fee and how much? And then the other question is, how are you going to help me monitor my financial plan, and how often is that going to be? So we've given you a lot of information here that I think is helpful. Actually, there's questions that you can go sit down and ask someone, whether you're going to do it in person or a phone interview. And the final thing that I want you to see is, and this is the engagement letter that, as a certified financial planner, I have to have folks that I sit down with who I'm engaging in financial planning actually sign this letter. It protects them, and it protects me. And as a service of the foundation, that's one of the things that Mark has asked me to come back and to do, is to work with our clergy who wanted to work with me. But this would be a letter that you would see, and I want you to see on there as well that each of us has responsibilities. You'd have a responsibility to get the information to me. I have a responsibility in a timely manner to get the financial plan back to you. I do absolutely no implementing at all, but I do monitoring of the plan to make sure that you followed through. And everything that I do is completely confidential, and there's absolutely no cost to you at all. It's pro bono. It is a service of your Florida United Methodist Foundation. Let me leave you with this quote. I'm a guy who collects quotes almost on a daily basis, but I think this one is very apropos to what we're doing. And it is, the man who achieves makes many mistakes. So when you're looking at your retirement planning, it's not an exact science, and you're going to make some mistakes. Just try to minimize the number of mistakes and make those mistakes very small. But the man who achieves makes many mistakes, but he never makes the biggest mistake of all, of doing nothing. That's sort of I consider that the Forrest Gump method of doing things, where if you remember how it goes, it just, and he's very fortunate, as happenstance happens to him. But that's not the way real life works. So I thank you for your time.